My partner had the baby and is at home with the baby now. But it did add to my thinking relatively recently about, who, what, when, when should a basic income right potentially emerge, both in terms of the life course. And I will go on. And so it got me thinking about babies for UBI, but then I was thinking about my little daughter, Abby, and she's a bit of a bludger. She doesn't work. She's 4 months old. She creates a lot of work for others. But should she, despite these obvious demerits, have a right to a basic income? And if so, on what basis? And we have all these familiar, to those of you who are immersed in the literature, all of these arguments are going to be pretty familiar, and for people new to the movement, they won't be. So going back to Tom Paine's basic income is fundamentally grounded in a principle of justice, and it's not a form of charity. Or Philippe Van Parijs, who you'll be hearing from tomorrow, his arguments regarding real freedom for all being this liberal egalitarian or real libertarian criterion of distributive justice. Ferguson's a rightful share. I could add Karl's exo-freedom, or the radical thinker Andre Gortz's linking of basic income to the idea of an exit route from capitalism. Or we could get more pragmatic and talk about the empirical evidence of the long-term benefits in terms of health and economic benefits for people who receive some form or a proxy of basic income. And then a couple of the points that I'll linger on a bit longer in subsequent slides: the social and evolutionary nature of wealth in capitalist society and the peculiar character of money in a capitalist society. Okay, so we have this issue. Kids don't work these days. A little bit of a, very clever juxtaposition there. Babies don't work. Kids don't work. So if we do think of a baby emerging into the world bringing with it this right to a basic income, is that right then potentially revoked or voided when they then enter into this entanglement with the paid labour market? And we have the introduction of all these different arguments regarding the legitimacy of basic income in a capitalist society where a huge cohort of people are expected to sell their labour power for a wage for a good chunk of their life. And there are different responses within the basic income literature to this problem. I'm not going to go into them, particularly not the jobs as assets argument from Philippe, but to summarise very quickly, the idea of human beings if we treat jobs as assets, human beings have an equal right to benefit from the rents that are attached to jobs in imperfect markets. Different angles on the reciprocity debate, whether it's Philippe or Carol Pateman or Stuart White, Tony Atkinson on participation income, and many, many others. Andre Gortz's argument that it's an absurdity to make voluntary work compulsory, the sort of rejoinder to a participation income. And then I'm finishing up, a participation activity may be a useful political strategy to counter the force of a capitalist work ethic, but I would argue that it's not needed to justify basic income as a right. So, the problem of work for basic income. So, on the one hand, we have certain distortions that are introduced, we see time and again, in basic income pilots, experiments, whatever we want to call them, where there becomes an over-focus on the labour supply response effects of receiving a basic income that tends to drown out a whole lot of other interesting, qualitative or, broader sociological understanding or research objectives of what it means to receive an unconditional income for a period of time. So that can be an issue of this entanglement of work and basic income. Then some obvious points regarding work in a capitalist society. Capital considers the working age population their prime real estate, which has been disgracefully reduced by things like abolishing child labour and introducing age pension and those types of things. Another barrier is basic income as many have written, like Koleski, Koleski's talking about principles of full employment, but Olin Wright, Mike Howard, Carl's collaborator over many years, basic income challenges the employer's prerogative to dictate terms of the employment bargain. And then we also have this issue of when we prioritise work, it potentially becomes an alternative, as we've seen recently with something like the Jobs and Skills Summit and Issues paper, and a potential distraction from those with an interest in pursuing universal basic income or asserting it as a right. Full employment, job guarantee, all the other policies that we're familiar with become detours, potentially way off the path from basic income. I say this as someone also that I'm not against full employment or necessarily a job guarantee, although potentially that undermines aspects of my own argument. Okay, so I'm getting to my third last slide. So how could we imagine articulating the sort of theoretical basis of a work-free right to basic income? So I start off with this idea that we all suffer this sort of triple accident of birth. You have no control over the time, place, or say class into which you emerge at the point of birth. Then this is sort of an internal argument. Wealth is to the basic income literature that is against this focus on external resources, which is a sidebar that I'm not going to go into. But just this point that capitalism is fundamentally, in a capitalist society, wealth is fundamentally social and evolutionary. And it is impossible to assign, using any particular theory, I would argue, a precise monetary amount that meets so-and-so person X's contribution to this, to the stocks and flows that together comprise the cumulative wealth of capitalist society at either a national or global level. In a capitalist society, income is a basic need. Right? It is either direct or indirectly, it's impossible to function without income. Whereas paid market work is not a basic need. In Australia, for example, only around half the population is in paid work. Okay? We have 13 million people who are good workers and 13 million bludgers, children, old people. Anyone else who's not in the paid labour market. Obviously, I'm joking for anyone who didn't get that joke. But it just illustrates the point that we have all sorts of different people receiving types of income that are fundamental to meeting basic needs and functioning, participating in Australian society or some other society, whereas being continuously in the paid labour market is not a fundamental requirement. Finally, I'd just like to argue that money has this unique quality in capitalist society. So we could imagine a supercomputer that would potentially generate superior welfare outcomes by giving every individual in society a particular combination of goods and services that is superior to a quantum of cash, right? But for making a concession to pragmatism, money has this particular versatility and fungibility to be able to meet a diversity of needs in a way that no other, say combination of this amount of healthcare and this amount of public housing could meet in quite the same way that reflects the diversity of the human beings who constitute a given society. Okay, so my next point. Rights are asserted. They are sort of asserted into existence, I'd argue, in many cases. And I've just got this Ferguson quote here about the sort of power of demand sharing and making basic income part of a righteous claim for a due and proper share grounded in nothing more than membership in a national or other collectivity or simply presence. Right? It's something that is demanded to be a right. Of course, in the messy world of everyday politics, compromise is inevitable. And here we do have a kid putting in some hard yakka. But a right to a basic income that we bring with us into but a right to basic income that we bring into the world with us, a right that precedes the experience of paid labour and the debates that surround it in relation to basic income, may be useful in extricating basic income from the problem of work. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Troy. Don't go too far. So thanks for that explication, and it's getting us off a nice philosophical theme, I guess, for the whole session, really. Ben will follow in a moment, but we do have some time for some questions, either from the room, and I'll check with Bridget in a minute when there's any online. Questions or comments? Ben? Shit, mate, I was going to say, you get your turn in a moment. Jane, yep.
Yeah, your comment about the triple accident of birth, and you mentioned class as your third option. I would suggest that it's much bigger than class, because I didn't choose to have a disability. People don't choose their colour. There's a whole bunch of other things besides class. And your joke wasn't funny. I presume you haven't been referred to as a bludger, but I have. I have 3 degrees and spent 7 years on JobSeeker. That's why it wasn't funny.
Please clarify, Troy.
Yeah. So to the second point, I just offer a sincere apology for that. And on the first point, you're completely correct that it should be a far broader definition than class. And all maybe so. I don't know what the precise term is that would be a catch-all term for that idea of a triple accident, but it doesn't have to be a triple accident. It's merely, I was trying to make that point that, not just the point that you're in very different circumstances as a person born into a working class family in Australia compared to, say, a person born into a peasant household in 16th century Japan. Like, it was that kind of broader point as well as, but I still, I would amend that framework to reflect what you said.
Thanks, Troy. And I think also to acknowledge Jane's point about, people with disability and disability movement's been really strong in the campaign about the right not to work as well as the right to work. And I think that's been really important part of decoupling income from labour in terms of the UBI movement. Any other comments? Yes, please.
Yeah. What's the point of full employment?
What's the point of full employment?
Yeah, why have it?
I feel like this would detour away from my paper. Like, full employment is a whole lot of different things at different points in time, right? Full employment, you could just say, is everyone who wants to have a job in the paid labour market is able to get one. Yeah, and we know that capitalism has booms and busts, and then at certain periods of time there'll be a lower aggregate amount of jobs that are available. Hence, you have arguments for something like direct public sector job creation or a job guarantee.
And about the point, you just want to control the population by shoving them into jobs. That's kind of what it actually does, isn't it?
Look, I would say that's a little bit of a narrow view of all the different things that jobs do give people. And I'm not celebrating paid labour and putting it on a pedestal and saying it's better than all these sorts of other activity. Absolutely not. That's like the opposite of what I'm arguing. But I'm also not going to go completely the other way and say all paid jobs mean nothing to people in terms of their identity, what they're able to do, the choices they're able to make in life.
Carl?
Would you next, Ben?
No, he's pointing to you.
Opt out. Oh, well, all I could do would be offer like additional ammunition. You mentioned the exo freedom thing that I argued that we're actually forcing people to work by denying them access to resources, but there's many other things that happen. Like the distribution of property we have is not reciprocal. There's two reciprocal ways to distribute the resources of the earth. One is equally or share them all. We divide them equally or share access to them. We don't do either one. Small group gets privileged access with no reciprocal obligation to anybody else whatsoever. And then we say, oh, you can't give you a UBI. That would be something for nothing. No, you got something for nothing. Unless you pay a UBI, we are violating the principle of reciprocity. We're also violating the principle of reciprocity in another sense, that those people who own all the resources are exempt from this responsibility to work. So we have a non-reciprocal application of the responsibility to work. Okay, I'm a little too jet-lagged to remember the other, but there's several others.
Thanks, Carl, and we can continue the conversation afterwards. But, as someone who's done so much work on this topic, I appreciate the feedback and just say thanks. And when I was reflecting on it a little bit today and just thinking about basic income being both a status right, as you've argued, and potentially a scale of freedom, as Philippe has argued, that you potentially have a status right to basic income that adheres to the person for some of the reasons that we've discussed, but the quantum, the way that right is expressed in a material sense or a monetary sense is scalar and changes over time.
Yeah. Can I follow up with, can you save the joke by saying my baby is the kind of person that the UBI opponents would cruelly dismiss as this, that, or the other thing? Is that just as offensive?
I don't think I will forget about that. Tamia?
So I'm hoping that I articulate the question properly. I have no idea if I'm going to get there. So I'm wondering if rather than, so there's a very specific kind of work that you're talking about, which is work that involves a wage relation, right? Rather than the production of value in and of itself. So there's productive labour, there's reproductive labour, there's also the value that children and disabled people and older people bring to the world that is kind of intangible and not subject to the wage relation. Is the problem with work or is the problem with the wage relation?
Thanks for that question. I think in a capitalist society, it's very difficult to disentangle work from the wage relation. Of course, I agree with you about all social reproductive labour and have argued, and other forms of labour, and have argued very strongly for basic income on those grounds as a type of partial reciprocal recognition for undervalued, unseen, under-remunerated types of activity. Yeah, so this was not, I suppose I'm trying to, because the basic income literature there are and debates between advocates and critics, there is such a problem in discussing reciprocity around the capitalist wage relation or paid labour, however you want to frame it. I'm trying to think of basic income as a right that precedes that entanglement. It's partly an intervention in internal debates within BI literature, which I realise is not everyone's been reading thousands of articles about basic income. But more broadly, I think it's important to think about it as a primary right, that it's a useful political tool as well as an ethical or philosophical point.
Yeah, that in a society, in a society that's dependent on a monetary system and money is a right.
Yeah, I'd just say finally, because I know Greg's winding me up, but I'd say maybe a whole lot of the argument that I just put maybe wouldn't stand at all in a non-capitalist society.
Thanks, Troy. I think Carl's left the room, but we'll have to. It's quite appropriate that he is sometimes called the Pavarotti of the basic income movement. Troy, that address, thank you very much. In terms of Carl's question, I think it's a the difference between the individual rights and the rightful share argument James Ferguson puts forward. I think he would argue, James Ferguson, that the rightful share argument is more important than the individual right to the basic income in that sense. But in terms of this whole debate about the worth ethic and the worthwhile ethic, I think that David Frame, who you mentioned, is a nice distinction in acknowledging the various ways in which people make a contribution to the world. Social reproduction only being one other form of that. So the work debate, a little bit of infomercial for Kathy Weeks is giving an address on the problem with work. Many people probably have read her book, The Problem with Work, and that's on Wednesday morning. So Kathy won't be here in person, but she will be streaming an address to get into this question, which would be a nice segue from Troy's presentation as well. So without any further ado, we now welcome Ben Spies-Butcher, who's delivering a paper on behalf of himself, and Dr. Roger Patulny, and it's a very long title, so Ben can read it out.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Greg. And yes, I think I'm going to blame Roger for the title. So we're going to go into it. But from philosophical to pragmatic and political. Is this open? Yeah, we go. And that can be seen on there. So this is looking at political constituencies in favour of the possibility of advancing a basic income, and reports some work from a survey in the Australian Survey of Social Attitudes, as I'll go through in a second, which replicates one from the European survey. Yeah.
Sorry, Ben, do you want to switch it just so it's full display mode?
I just wanted to make sure they could see it there, but they can't really see anyway, I don't think.
That's good.
It's better for you?
Yeah.
That's good. Okay.
Yeah.
The contrast means that it's just white for the folks at home. I apologise for that. So this is part of a wave that sort of started in the middle of the 2010s, looking at what the political constituencies for in a kind of serious way. There was a bit of work before that. What the political constituencies for basic income were, and we're particularly and riffing off the theme here, looking at its relationship to, you might say, old-fashioned materialist politics of the welfare state and work, rather than a post-materialist politics, which is it's often associated with. That is a transformational vision of something else that comes later. So we're looking at that in Australia and then putting it in the context of these European surveys, which have also happened, and we're replicating exactly the same question. So in terms of the European evidence, maybe partly surprisingly, for those who don't already know it, and some of you will, is that the support is surprisingly materialist. That is, it is quite closely linked to how wealthy countries are, what their social security system looks like, and even within countries, to people in strong forms of economic insecurity. So people outside the labour market who have very little access to income. And it is far less related to the things we might have thought of as post-materialist, particularly education, which has a weird relationship. It is somewhat correlated in some countries, but broadly across Europe, people with high levels of education are not more likely to support basic income than people without high levels of education, which is usually seen as one of the key benchmarks of a post-materialist support base. So we wanted to look at that in Australia and see who supports basic income and who doesn't. I think we're increasingly getting close to the point where we can just say basic income and people in surveys random people might actually understand what you're talking about. I don't think we were quite there yet, and we certainly weren't at the time the European survey was done. And this survey, as I'll say, was fielded. We started doing this in 2019, 2020. And so part of the sample is before COVID and part of the sample is after COVID. And we have made some analysis of what that was likely to have done to the respondents. So that's the question. It's a very long question that sets out what a basic income does, how it gets funded, how it relates to the social security system. It's exactly the same question as the one in the European survey. Yeah, and then it just has this strongly in favour to strongly against support, expression of support. So I'm not going to go through all of that, but you can see that it's a funded model that also partly replaces existing welfare state measures. So we wanted to look at these two questions. First of all, how do we relate to Europe, and how would we relate, that is, who is it within Australia that supports a basic income? And so the rest of the countries are from the European survey, and our result is there for Australia. As you can see, Australia is almost exactly in the middle. And if you look at the countries right at the top, we've got tend to be countries which have lower mean incomes and less expensive social insurance schemes anyway. They often do have forms of reasonable welfare states. And you can see some of the particularly notable big welfare states of Europe with high incomes at the bottom. So there does seem to be this relationship there. And Australia is very close to the United Kingdom, which is is also a model we're reasonably similar to. We tend to have a pretty stingy welfare state, but we tend to be pretty high income as well. So that makes sense of this being roughly in the middle. And then we looked at who it was that supported basic income in Australia. So these are confidence intervals that give you a bit of an idea. If they don't overlap, that means there's a real difference. If they do overlap, who knows? It could just be a little bit of random error. And so just drawing attention to the fact that we seem to have much stronger support from young people, much stronger support from people who are not in the paid workforce, but also who are not retired, people on lower incomes. And this particularly interesting result, which I'm going to go into in a second, is people that rent rather than own either outright or have a mortgage. And that relationship, as we'll see in a second, holds through quite a bit of statistical testing and seems to be pretty unique, at least against Europe, to Australia. That is, that our housing system seems to be creating forms of insecurity which are quite meaningful in the way that people understand the sorts of security they might get from a basic income. I think also it's just useful to note there that people who are retired and who own their own homes are the group that is least likely to support this. But if one thinks about it for a second, are more or less the group in Australia that already have it. That is, if you own your own home and you're retired, you're on the age pension, it's the closest thing we basically have to a basic income already. So that's demographics. We also looked at in terms of political support. You can see that basic income is associated with parties of the left. Sorry, I'll do these things so you can see that a little bit more. There is some evidence that it's more associated with working class rather than middle class, and this is self-assessed class position. And that there is all of those inequality ones, these ones here, are all against that people are to blame for their own poverty, more or less. So they're all higher than that. And these are also, who is it that's supposed to deal with poverty? So obviously people who say the poor are the ones who have to deal with it versus other groups in society. So it's associated with reasonably standard support for the left. And we've got, we do a bunch of regressions to try and identify which of those effects is dominant. So just here to show that we do see quite a strong relationship with education. So we have, and hence the complicated note, the title of the paper is we seem to have two distinct constituencies that are at play here. One that is associated with post-materialism and one that's associated with forms of strong economic precarity. And those two constituencies both seem to support a basic income over groups that have more traditional materialist values and are more economically secure. So this rent home stays in, including people that live in the suburbs. Like that's certainly the opposite of post-materialism generally understood. And in small towns, when we unpacked it, we found that left-leaning stuff that we saw last time is not actually the left in general, it's just the Greens. So there is a strong association between Greens voters and support for basic income. Interestingly, this is, so 2019, 2020 is before the Greens kind of really highlight this policy at the last federal election. It is already in the platform. So it suggests there's a little bit of moving in both directions. That is, the Greens base is demanding something which the Greens are supplying, which might also be reinforcing that their base identify with it. But nonetheless, there's a strong overlap there. And it is also associated with strong support for reducing inequality. So wrapping up, against Europe, we found that Australia's more or less in the middle of the pack. We did find some evidence that the sample sizes weren't quite big enough to be really confident about this, but certainly those that responded after the pandemic payment, the COVID supplement was introduced, were more likely to support basic income than those that responded before the pandemic and the payment was released. The sample afterwards was relatively small, so we can't be that confident, but there is some evidence that supports that. We find that the emergence of a constituency is amongst those who are young, currently not in the workforce, but aren't able to access our guaranteed income for those over retirement age, but also those who are much more highly educated and those who are renters. And having also done some analysis of the last election results recently, some of the shift that this suggests also overlaps a shift that seems to have started to happen within the Greens voter base too, which is that the younger part of the Greens voter base is now far less defined by education than the older part of. So there's a dividing line around in people in their 40s, where people above their 40s who vote for the Greens are much, much more likely to have gone to university. But that's not true of the younger explosion of voters that the Greens got at the last election, who are much more likely to be defined by their relationship to asset ownership. And so this suggests that maybe there is some emergence of overlapping constituencies. But we do still see that education plays a strong role here. And so we're, I suppose, suggesting that the way forward in Australia is to find a way to be able to bridge that gap, to be able to unite parts of a post-materialist constituency, but broaden that out, particularly to a younger base of voters who experience precarity through both the labour market and the housing market. And that's more or less what that says. And I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben. I'm just going to check with Bridget. Any questions online? No. Come on online, people. We need to get louder. Anyone in the room got a comment?
Can I just ask, just maybe tell the online people to put in the Q&A box rather than the chat in case they're doing that.
Okay, so just to remind people online to put their question in the Q&A box, not the chat.
Thanks.
May make a difference. Let's see. Thanks, Ben, for a very interesting paper unpacking the political support for UBI in Australia compared to other countries. One of the things I was wondering as you were speaking, while people think of their questions, is the relationship between your survey, I guess, and the one that Anglicare did just after the COVID supplement. And they also looked at some demographic differences, but they were showing, I think, 2/3 of support for people with basic income compared to the Greens Institute study a couple of years earlier, which was about 50%.
Yeah.
How
do we square that circle?
With you,
So Anglicare did do a very similar survey at about the same time. So you saw that ours is modelled on that European survey. It says how it's going to be funded. The Anglicare one didn't.
Oh, okay.
And that's actually consistent with other international evidence, which suggests that when you don't tell people about the fact that you have to fund it from somewhere, you get much higher support. And that those relativities are actually about right. So if you look at some studies so that's a large chunk. But they also found that older people were much more supportive of it there. So it does seem to be that there might be a bit of a competition effect, you might say, from older folk who are worried about undermining the security that they're able to access.
Good, thanks, Ben. Jim.
Oh, hi, thanks. Very interesting presentation. I was interested, you said there wasn't a lot of support among people identified as Labour supporters, Labour Party supporters. And we've had the same issue in Canada. Maybe it's changing, but certainly historically, skepticism, if not antipathy, towards the basic income idea among Social Democrats and Labour leaders. Labour rank and file to some extent. So I just was curious if from your data or just from your analysis of the data, if you sort of suss out like what's the Labour Party in Australia? What's are there kind of different strains or different areas of support or objection to UBI, whether the
Yeah.
is any of that?
So certainly, thank you very much for the question. From our data, there's not opposition. So Labor voters weren't less likely. They were just voting Labor made no difference to their support for basic income. Support for the Greens was strongly correlated, and there was another category for voting for someone else, which is a bit messy because it's everybody else, but it's dominated by micro right parties. And there was evidence the micro right were opposed, but neither of the mainstream parties did it seem to make much difference. But in terms of the broader question, there's similar dynamics in Australia. There has been, and Troy's probably better at answering this than me, but there certainly has been some people in Labor ranks who have expressed at least an openness to basic income, but there are several who have been explicitly opposed. And that is strong, I think quite bound up with both those arguments about work, but also the strong support for targeting, which is supported by the Labor Party as seen as almost an essential thing that they've brought to the Australian welfare state. And the folks that they get to advise them, who are largely mainstream economics trained, really do see those targeting arguments as, they just think it's fiscally irresponsible. We've got an extremely fiscally conservative left party by, global standards. So.
I think the comment about the branches too is that some branches are very active in the ALP, particularly in regional branches, and then they try to get onto the national platform for the ALP annual conference, and it gets voted down at every instance. So it's never been supported. Even in getting it onto the platform for discussion, that's how much resistance there is to even having the debate within the ALP at their annual conference. Bridget, there is a question, and then Carl's got one as well, but let's go online.
In the Australian context, how should we frame funding of the UBI to fiscal conservatives?
So it's a question about framing UBI to fiscal conservatives in the Australian context, Ben.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I think you probably see from some of the younger support that there might be an opportunity to be less fiscally conservative and still get some political support base in Australia. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But I do think that's going to be one of the main challenges, and certainly the approach that we've been exploring at our basic income lab around that has been, I suppose, forms of incrementalism that try to remove the most pernicious parts of the system. So removing conditionality, individualising payments, removing or weakening the very strong forms of targeting that we have, so that you have at least modest forms of targeting. And I think similar to what you heard from Scott this morning, that strong opposition to giving money at the very top. And we also, in fact, heard in Korea as well, right? So I think that's probably more likely in our circumstances, something that starts to expand payments to, you might say, to the majority that aren't necessarily strictly universal, although you can probably tamper around with the tax system, so in practice they are.
Don't go far, Ben, because Carl's going to throw you something. Before you, last question we might take from Carl, unless there's any others in the room.
Jim's question, which I took to being about laborers or labor union members more than Labor Party, actually reminded me of something I was going to say to Troy that I think in response to you as well, is to me the labor, one of the obvious responses to the work argument and to whether there should be labor support for you guys, the worst thing in the world you can do to a worker is to put them in a position where they have no other choice but to take a job to survive. And there's nothing pro-labor about denying a laborer the power to say no to a bad job. And that's an easy one for Troy to put on his list of ammunition. But for you're trying to explain what's going on, it's always been a mystery to me. When this has been out there since Thomas Paine, this kind of argument, or at least since Eric Olin Wright, but it doesn't seem to catch on with labor union members, with trade union members, and I don't know why that is when it is an enormous strike fund, as Eric Olin Wright said.
Yeah, and so I completely agree with the principles of the argument. In terms of the data, we did do it by occupational category as well and just didn't find that there was any correlation. So including amongst professionals and amongst managers, there wasn't any particular strong support or opposition amongst different occupational groups. But most of the things that were associated, so being at the margins of the labour force, being renting, living in the suburbs, I think you might all say are forms of economic marginalisation. And I think what's interesting is that it's not strictly about occupation, but it is about these other forms of economic marginalisation. And they are very strongly correlated. And so I think that experience is not necessarily the experience of being in work, but certainly the experience of being in insecure work. That's what seems to be driving a desire to be able to have something that's concrete and that underpins people's livelihoods.
I have just one quick question, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer it, but in terms of the data that you collect, I feel like there's a lot of moralising, I suppose, that happens with the basic income debate. And do you ask for those signifiers as well in terms of trying to understand opposition or support for basic income?
Yeah, so quickly, I mean, that's partly what those questions that say who's responsible for inequality, who's responsible. Yeah, so, and it is very strongly correlated with structural causes of poverty and structural solutions to poverty. And opposition is very strongly correlated with people who think that it's all up to individuals and they need to solve their own problems. So in terms of that existing, you might say, primary ideological divide of the welfare state, this is absolutely bound up with that.
And do you think that because Australia has a conservative economic system and has pretty much always had so, there's a swing towards more conservative people? Why do we have such conservative?
Look, I mean, I think so very quickly that I think there's some good evidence from the last two elections that the strong age differential that we see with this, but we now also see in voting patterns, and that's not just in Australia, but it particularly has happened recently in Australia, is about asset ownership. And that particularly around housing, but it's actually around all assets. And I think we are seeing a divide where the lack of other forms of security is forcing asset ownership to be the last resort of most people to be able to anchor their lives. And in a world where that is quite unequally distributed, it's actually still, asset ownership is still relatively egalitarian in Australia compared to other countries, but it's becoming less so over time. And I think you're already seeing an emerging cohort of younger people who are being excluded from the traditional forms of security, for whom attitudes are changing quite rapidly, and I think do open up space for more radical alternatives.
Thanks, Ben, for all of that interesting discussion and response to questions. And I think the linking of the housing market and the labour market. Oh, sorry, Johnson, you please.
So you suggested expanding the existing PI, like a pension, as a possible strategy. So Australia doesn't have a universal pension like New Zealand. So is there a strong demand call for reforming the pension like the New Zealand system?
It's a great question. So Australia doesn't have a universal pension. It's means tested, but it's means tested so that about 40% of people get the full pension, about 40% get a part pension, and there's 20% who are entirely privately funded. So it has universal-like features in this Australian you might say affluence tested model, where we test out the rich, but we don't only confine it to the poor. So the pension is the payment that looks most like that in Australia. Both those means tests, the income one and the assets one, cause a whole bunch of problems. And we've had both parties in the last month talking about new workarounds that they're introducing to make work pay for people who are over retirement age. We've got a series of other workarounds to try and help people move because of the assets test excluding the family home. So there is, I think, an appetite to reform the pension, to move it in a more universal direction, to try and get rid of the problems of the income test. We did have a push to increase the age of the age pension, but that has now, if anything, I think started to reverse. So I think you can actually see that debate of, pushing up the age has now completely stopped. And if anything, we might have opportunities to push it back down. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. and we may have time to connect these papers potentially at the end of the session before lunch at 12:30. But it now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Zoe Staines, School of Social Science, University of Queensland, to talk about work and well-being in remote Australia, moving beyond punitive workfare. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everyone. Just bear with me for a moment. Okay, I'm going to stand over here if that's okay. Hopefully you can all see me. But online you'll get to see my slides, which is much prettier, hopefully, than my face anyway. So thanks very much, everyone. I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples here in Brisbane, Meanjin, and pay respects to their leaders and elders, present, past and emerging as well. So as Greg mentioned, I am a senior research fellow here in the School of Social Science at UQ. I'll out myself at the start as a bit of a newbie to the basic income movement and literature, as kind of Troy sort of partly outed me at the start as well. So most of my research focuses on workfare programs, and particularly looking at workfare in remote parts of Australia, which predominantly affect First Nations peoples in Australia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I'll give a brief summary of workfare in remote Australia and its impacts. I suspect I'm preaching to the choir a little bit in terms of the quite horrid impacts of workfare, welfare to work sort of approaches. And then I want to just take you through, if you'll, move with me through this journey to consider some possibilities for improved wellbeing in remote Australia via a basic income in remote Australia. So similar to other neoliberal welfare states across the world, welfare to work or workfare activation policies have really intensified in recent decades in Australia, especially since the sort of mid-80s, where we had some severe activation policies start to be introduced. In Australia, some of you may know, but we do have different activation policies for urban and regional versus remote and very remote contexts. So it's geographically separated in terms of the policies that apply. The remote and very remote contexts account for about 86% of the country's landmass, and are actually home to about 18.1% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who live in Australia overall. And also home to many discrete Indigenous communities with majority Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, so upwards of sort of 80-90% First Nations peoples in those communities. Just to set some context, this is a legacy of settler colonial policies of forced removal and relocation of many people, First Nations peoples, from their unceded lands to these remote sort of settlements, which started as missions and reserves under highly racist and problematic protection laws in Australian history. So hence these policies that operate in remote Australia disproportionately affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The current policy that's in place, which is the Community Development Program or CDP, has about a participant load of about 80% First Nations peoples, to give you some context. For those who are not from Australia, the overall population of Australia, about just under 3% representative of First Nations people. So it's dramatically disproportionate in terms of the overrepresentation in this particular policy in remote Australia. So just to take you through a really brief history, and this is a whip around, 40 years. So we started out in Australia in remote areas under a policy called CDEP, the Community Development Employment Project Scheme, which was essentially something akin to a job guarantee, but not quite, where unemployment benefits, what would otherwise be unemployment benefits, were provided in lump sum to remote communities and Aboriginal councils. And they were then used to pay a wage for locally valuable work, and that was a locally determined decision. Fast forward a few decades to 2007 and towards the sort of gradual removal of the CDEP and the introduction gradually of a series of what I argue are really problematic workfare programs. So over this time, some key changes have been, there's been a move away from stable incomes under CDEP as wages are kind of basic income, which Elise Klein has argued, for instance, in a couple of her papers. And I'll just explain that at this point as well. So in terms of the payment of CDEP by remote Aboriginal councils, some councils did choose to pay those wages or pay that income as essentially basic income with no obligation for work requirement or anything like that, particularly to First Nations peoples who were living on outstations on country. And so that's how it's been kind of theorised in some instances as a basic income as well. So there's been a move away from that and a movement of peoples into the social security system, which has resulted in lower and less stable incomes under these workfare programs more recently. There's been a move away from focus on local control over community development under CDEP, for instance, through social commercial enterprises, job creation, basic income, or the use of that income as a basic income, to a delivery in the workfare sector by third sector employment service providers. Often these providers aren't local, they're not from local community. It was the case up until about 2019 that many of these providers weren't even First Nations organisations. And so the policy changed at that point to require that they must be First Nations organisations. But that's problematic for a whole bunch of other reasons as well, in terms of local, identification with local community needs and things like that versus very large First Nations organisations that don't necessarily have that local knowledge. Under workfare, conditionalities and compliance have intensified over time, obviously, and there's been a strict focus on behaviour modification and little to no focus on structural causes of entrenched unemployment. Essentially there just aren't enough jobs in remote Australia and very remote Australia. There are very few jobs to go around. This is a structural unemployment issue. It has nothing to do with individuals and their behaviours. So some impacts of remote workfare, and I'm drawing on a number of different projects that I've been working on over the past few years. Compliance penalties have been applied at higher rates than any other workfare program in Australia under CDP, the current workfare program in remote Australia. So we've seen a dramatic reduction in incomes that are already very low because there is such structural or widespread structural unemployment in remote communities. You've got a lot of people then relying on what's now the job seeker benefit, was New Start benefit, unemployment, social security income, which is already dramatically low, then being breached for not maybe showing up to job appointments and things like that every week, and then having that income reduced even further. So incomes have been dramatically reduced. And this has exacerbated poverty that's already caused by these very low social security payments, as well as, of course, the ongoing traumas of colonial policies and practices, which are ongoing, including through the CDP itself, the application of this quite draconian policy itself. As a result of lower incomes, we've got lots of evidence now that people are going without food, so not being able to purchase food in remote communities. Another aspect or another part of the context with remote Australia is that food costs are really, really high. There might be one or two shops in most remote communities, at least the ones that I've spent time in, and the food costs there are incredibly, incredibly high. So you have low incomes, reduced even further through these draconian workfare measures, higher costs of food and high costs of living generally in remote Australia. So the balance is really, really problematic. There's another kind of layer to this in terms of remote Australia where mutual obligations that require participants to stay in community, so in the township and not away from community on country or outstations, reduce access to homelands because people actually have to stay in to fulfill their mutual obligations. So to be able to visit their employment services provider, go to the work for the dole, go to the job seeker interviews and things like that, they actually have to remain in the confines of the community. So this is really problematic in terms of reducing access to homelands. And after all of this, what is the point of all of this? Punishment. There are very little to no improved employment outcomes, of course, because to circle right back around, there are very few jobs. So workfare punishes individuals while really doing nothing at all about the structural causes of unemployment in remote Australia. And policies and, decades of policies to try and improve the number of jobs available in remote Australia have repeatedly failed. So I want to switch now, if I can, to talking a little bit about hope for an alternative. So CDP, I'm happy to report, will be completely abolished by 2023. So we now have a commitment by the Labor government that CDP will be completely removed. There are several different policies on the table. So the direction from here is a bit unclear. There are several different proposals for Fair Work and Strong Communities by an Aboriginal organisation, which includes like a wage subsidy component. There's a job guarantee proposal written by Bill Mitchell and Noel Pearson, which I was alluding to last night, Carl, and a livable income guarantee by John Quiggin, Elise Klein and colleagues as well. So these proposals are on the table. I do go through in my published paper in the journal and sort of analyse each of these different proposals. I just want to switch a little bit off that today and talk a little bit more about, what about a basic income? Okay, so these are the proposals that are on the table. There are also different trials underway under a new piece of legislation called the Remote Employment Program, although they're slow going, and none of those propose, to my understanding, a basic income or anything that's unconditional. So all of these options that are on the table are conditional. So these different avenues have varying impacts on possible incomes and wellbeing in remote Australia. Like I said, that's the focus of my paper. But I want to think a little bit about a need to get back to first principles here, right? Like, this is a ridiculous policy mess, I would argue, over the last sort of 30 years in remote Australia. The recent workfare policy has led to many, including myself, alongside other colleagues, to argue that there is a desperate need to think about these first principles when making policies for remote Australia. So the social security system should obviously provide security rather than punish people, right? And so under workfare, it dramatically fails in this task. Repeatedly, I don't know how much more proof we need that it is an absolute failure in remote Australia and in other parts of Australia. So we've been calling for policy changes that would shift the focus away and recenter well-being and caring in remote Australia. What would a policy that does that look like? So in doing so, we draw on conceptualizations of well-being that prioritise collectivist perspectives and include connection to country, spirit, mind, body, family, community, and culture. And in terms of caring, we also use this term broadly, not just to refer to reproductive labour, as we might understand it through, Western sort of literature, but to refer to caring not only for people, but caring for culture, caring for country, and these sorts of things as well. So we are calling for, within this broader context, that, at least on paper, we are calling for this sort of change within a broader context, a broader policy context in Australia, that at least on paper focuses apparently, or is meant to focus on improving general wellbeing and socioeconomic outcomes for First Nations peoples across Australia. Doesn't do a very good job of that in practice. So my previous speakers have sort of alluded to the COVID-19 changes, and we heard a little bit about that in other countries, like Scott spoke about it this morning, and what we can learn from this. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that now, and then I'll finish up. As many of you will know, in 2020 and 2021, there was a removal of mutual obligations. So CDP as a policy kind of still continued on for about this year context, but just as a sort of basic skeleton of its former self, right? So all mutual obligations were suspended. And with the COVID-19 supplement payment, the rate of payment was dramatically increased and essentially doubled for a period of time. So my question for the next few slides is, well, what did this do? What did this look like in remote Australia if we conceptualise this as sort of a window into what might be the case under a basic income in terms of wellbeing and caring? So we've found, and again, this relates, or I've drawn on data from my own research interviews through my DECRA as well as other secondary sources to sort of come up with these points. But under workfare, as I said, there's a lack of temporal and spatial autonomy, must stay in town to meet with providers. Traditional food provisioning on country is made more difficult through this. But under the COVID-19 supplement, more people were able to leave the community, the confines of the community, and move and spend time on country, undertake things like camping, fishing, and we've got lots of interesting anecdotal evidence about, what this meant for people, what this meant for people's diets when they weren't just purchasing quite poor quality and expensive food in community versus actually going out and having fresh food from the land. And, lots of people have said just this, right? People are looking more healthy. People are actually happier. They're actually going out, they're able to eat better. So this has a really important impact on caring for country, culture, and also well-being, because many cultural activities take place outside of the confines of a community and on country. It's really important. In terms of caring for people as well, so high rates of penalties and breaches have lowered the overall incomes. Unaffordable food in remote Australia become less affordable, and we've actually found that in the last sort of 5 to 6 years since the CDP was implemented, I'm a criminologist by training. I'll out myself as that as well, but data around theft has increased over this time in all remote communities in Queensland, which is where we did our analyses. And we've got lots of anecdotal evidence that, people are actually being forced to steal food, right? And so we then redid our analyses of these crime data for this period of this intervention with the COVID-19 change, and found statistically significant reductions in theft, right? And so in property crime during this period as well, which has again, and we need to rerun our analyses again, but again started to creep up since this was tapered off. So this is really significant, not only in terms of making sure that people are well fed, but then caring for people in a more holistic way. First Nations peoples are dramatically overrepresented in the criminal justice system in Australia for a whole bunch of different reasons, both as victims and offenders. And the idea that a social security policy would increase that connection or contact with the criminal justice system is just abhorrent, I would say. So there have been, under the COVID-19 supplement, a whole lot of really positive changes like this as well. So against this backdrop, what appetite might there be then for something like a basic income in remote Australia? Unfortunately, and this kind of touches on a little bit of what Ben was saying earlier, but the real jobs kind of rhetoric continues. I mean, it's really firmly there, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon, unfortunately. And so this is an example of a recent quote from MP Linda Burney around, the need to replace the Community Development Program, or CDP, with a program that produces real jobs, proper wages. There's this kind of undercurrent of, not really understanding the situation in remote communities in terms of there being really strong structural unemployment, and this idea that any job is good enough, but what about well-being? I think to Carl's point before, if you're forced into a job, if that's your only option, then that's actually not good enough. As I said before, all of the proposals on the table are for conditional programs and conditional policies. Myself and Elise Klein and some other colleagues, John Altman and John Quiggin and Francis Markham down at ANU, have come up with a policy proposal that we've put to the ALP, and so they've received that. Negotiations with them on that policy proposal for at least a sort of base level, basic income in remote Australia haven't been amazingly well received. So we'll keep on at that and see how we go. And, that's kind of where we're at in terms of this, which kind of alludes to the title, which is There is Much Work to Do, unfortunately, I would say. Okay, so some brief final thoughts and then I'll finish up. I would just say again, considering options for the future should have the starting point of asking what might a strategy that prioritises well-being over work in terms of, a waged kind of labour connection look like? What are the intentions and aspirations of remote living Indigenous peoples more broadly? And how might a future strategy recognise and meet these needs and aspirations? There's a diverse range of perspectives in First Nations constituents in terms of what they want to see going forward, and that the most effective way to alleviate poverty and improve wellbeing in remote Australia, I think, and I would argue, is to provide an adequate and unconditional economic floor as a basic income, which would give at least unemployed peoples, secure access to basic needs like food and shelter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zoe. Important, I think, to take us back to first principles and also the importance of metaphors, and the language of economic floor is one that also resonates to some extent in the US, and it also resonates with trade unionists and some of the research that's been done, that basic income isn't an economic ceiling. But also your conception of justice, I think that it's not only about the redistribution of benefits, but also the distribution of burdens in society. And we know that our social security system places lots of burden on all sorts of populations, but none more so than Indigenous people, particularly with the conditional card that we had, and we're still going to have a version of, which was very racially discriminatory, and that will continue in one form or another, including in Cape York in North Queensland. So, questions on this topic, comments? Daria?
Can you say anything about any of the groundwork that's happening within community of Aboriginal leaders in regards to the necessary ideological shift to go from the notion of right jobs and work to wellbeing and constellation of wellbeing as a system?
Yeah. Do you mean in terms of consultation, government consultation, as well as groundwork that's been led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples?
I mean, the dialogue obviously, which has to go, multiple ways and directions. Within side of, Aboriginal leadership within the communities.
Yeah.
Is there much of that kind of understanding of the necessity of actually shifting that ideology?
Look, I would. There are disparate views, right? And there is a lot going on. It tends to be regional kind of focus, right? So there's a lot going on in the Cape, for instance. There's a lot going on in Central Australia. There's a lot going on in Kimberley. There are some really conservative, outspoken leaders, I suppose, in some of those regions. And so shifting that ideological kind of, basis is really, really difficult in some of those communities. But in terms of even just consultation on the new REP, the new policy that's coming forward, I just keep hearing from Aboriginal communities across Australia that what's going on, basically. Like, we haven't heard anything, where is our opportunity to have our input in terms of what we would like to see going forward, which is really problematic. And you'd be aware, comes off the back of a long history of poor consultation with First Nations communities. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, just like in regards to the strategy. Obviously that's got to be a part of it.
Yes.
Consultation.
Mm.
It sounds like there's a lot of work happening.
There is, yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Any others, yes, please.
So I don't know if I've got a question, but I'd be interested in your reflection. A couple of weeks ago, there was a consultation by the Human Rights Commission on an Aboriginal safety plan, a national safety plan for Aboriginal women. And Elise was there. I'm not sure if she was there for Minister Burney's contribution. But she said something that was quite striking, which was, in the process of getting rid of the CDP, we're going to look at ways to value Aboriginal women's care labour. And the reason why it was striking is obviously that is not on brand for the Labor Party. And you just said that you're hitting a lot of resistance, so I find it really interesting that she would step into a room with the entire Aboriginal, with Aboriginal civil society working in the area of family violence, who are all women who've been talking about this forever, and almost flat out lie when you're getting kind of different feedback. So how would it be possible for them to institute a policy where they say what they're doing is remunerating care labour, but not do it? Because how could you foresee them getting away with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the Human Rights Commission, I'm also actually partnering with, with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner and her team on a Wiani Utangani report, which is the Women's Voices and Care report, right? And so I suspect that's what Linda was talking to, MP Bernie was talking to more directly. Yes, yeah. So she's getting, and the NIAA are getting a lot of pressure from the Human Rights Commission to really take that more seriously, which is, I would say, really fantastic. On your question about how can she walk out into that room and say something that really actually directly contradicts how she's been speaking about real jobs, which entirely excludes reproductive labour that's overwhelmingly undertaken by women, of course, across Australia. But, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women undertake reproductive care labour at higher rates than anyone else in Australia, So your guess is as good as mine on the second point. Yeah.
Politicking.
Yeah, politicking, right? Yeah. That would be my best guess, unfortunately.
So we've got a question online, I think.
Yeah.
Bridget?
So Liam asks, given that prices in regional Australia can often be multiple times more expensive than in urban areas, is there going to be a need for additional supplements to the UBI for regional Australians to help bridge the gap in prices of basic commodities? Yeah,
thank you, Bridget. And thanks, Liam, online. Liam's actually one of my wonderful students. Shout out to Liam. It's so not a Dorothy Dixer. I didn't set him up with this at all. It's a really good point. And I think it's a really, there's a really strong basis for arguing that if a UBI policy was to be implemented in remote Australia, there is absolutely a need for a higher rate in remote Australia because of all of these issues. We have something akin to that in remote Australia anyway under the remote area subsidy, which is a very measly payment, mind you, but a payment that's unconditional and given to all people living in particular geographical areas, so remote and very remote geographical areas, which is intended to account for that higher cost of living. But it's now, if my memory serves me right, it's like $17.80 a fortnight, which is absolutely inadequate, and it's not indexed. So it's been $17.80 a fortnight for 20 years or something ridiculous like that. So there's a framework there for that, to argue for that need for an additional supplement or a higher rate in remote and very remote areas. But it needs to be much more adequate, obviously, than something like the remote area supplement. Yeah. Thanks, Liam.
Questions? We've got more minutes remaining. Yes, Jim.
Well, thanks for your presentation. Once again, I'm sort of thinking about this in relation to issues affecting Indigenous communities in Canada. Has there been any discussion in the Australian context about thinking about issues of economic livelihood in relation to Indigenous rights to the land, the wealth of the land? I mean, we've got a lot more progress yet to make on this in Canada, but like in a number of treaties on the prairie provinces, when the treaties were signed in the late 1800s, annuities were established as one of the rights. Now, there were small annuities in the late 1800s. They haven't been adjusted for inflation, so to speak, so they'll buy you a cup of coffee and a muffin at Easter's. But there was at least that principle established that there should be some recompense to the Indigenous people who are sharing the land
Absolutely.
from the Crown.
Yeah.
And I think it's related to, there's also, we have a small number of examples among Indigenous communities in North America of where communities have taken charge of their own economic development, to develop businesses or resource extraction or something, to earn money under modern treaties. And in some cases, some of that money goes back to the communities as a dividend or kind of a sort of a form of partial basic income. So I just was curious if there were any of those kind of discussions in Australia.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jim. Yeah, there absolutely are. In terms of political progress around those sorts of avenues, there absolutely are those discussions ongoing. I mean, reparations are much needed in the Australian context. And I know, like, we've got one of your wonderful First Nations MPs, Leah Gazan, on a panel tomorrow talking about her bill for a UBI in Canada. And, that's part of the argument as well, obviously. And it's very applicable to a settler colony like Australia. The discussions are ongoing. You'll probably know, Jim, we don't have any treaty, any history of treaty in Australia with First Nations peoples. So there's leveraging that sort of thing is difficult. We're in a process at the moment of responding to or implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which calls for treaty as part of those, a set of measures that will be implemented. So our current government's committed to implementing those. So in terms of leveraging that for those sorts of further discussions is really important. To your second point about mining and things like that, this all happens, and anyone else in the room who knows more about this, because I'm speaking a little bit out of my area of expertise now, but this all happens on a case-by-case basis, right? And so mining negotiations, to my exposure to them in remote communities, the power differentials are huge. So the right to sort of argue or to make sure that some sort of basic income could be paid out of that extractive sort of work on the land is really difficult. So organising around that, there's a lot of research around that by Kieran O'Fallagley, you might know, an Australian researcher. But in terms of the political kind of progress around those avenues, it would be my understanding is not much to date. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Maybe. Yeah.
Carl, if you're quick, we'll have time for a quick question from Carl. We might make that the last one.
Oh, no, I can't. A quick summary. Jim's question is another great tie-in with Troy's thing, and the just utter inconsistent application of the reciprocity principle of such a non-reciprocal land grab by the whites who say, "Oh no, we can't give you anything back unless you do something for us like workfare."
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Really good point.
Take that as a comment from Carl and a contribution rather than a question. So I just also wanted to mention, by way of acknowledgement really, that Ben, Troy and Zoe are all members of the local organising committee, and anyone who's organised one of these gigs knows that that's a big job. So the fact that they also, in Zoe's case, I think was up late last night preparing her slides. So the fact that we're also presenting, I think, should be recognised, because it's one thing to organise a conference and then also to have to get your thoughts together to deliver a paper. So well done to all of you. And I think there was lots of good connections there, particularly around the whole theme of work. And, COVID, I think, has really done a lot to unsettle that category. And I think that that's the thing that we can hold out some hope. The welfare system in Australia continues on its own path-dependent ways, and all the conditionality doesn't seem to be suspended in the ways that we might have hoped in a proper reset. But I think the fact that across the class, distinction, that there's a real kind of ways in which people in the class spectrum are rethinking work, and at least paid work component of what they do. Now, lots of those movements are overstated, of course, in terms of great resignation or quiet quitting. But I think there's an element in which, paid work is getting the bad rap. And that's good for us, I think, in the sense that it allows other conceptions that we've talked about today to be given the visibility that they need, not only in the individual sense, but also, as we said, in the collective sense, around an ethic of care, undermining or at least supplementing anything around work. So all that's good stuff, and I think sets us up nicely for the rest of the Congress. So thanks again, guys. And thanks to all of you. We've now got lunch in the same spot we had morning tea, and we're back at 1:30 for the other sessions. So thanks again. Thanks, man.
Thank you. Well, I think that you stood on the correct side of the microphone. I stood on the other side. I should block outside. Good.
No, if I'm using the slideshow, I've got notes in my slideshow.
Yeah.
Or will I just?
I think it's this one you'll be able to see them. So this one bears nothing.
Yeah.
So I'm just going
Oh,
to
okay.
just going to read this again.